Thank you so much. It's always a good sign when the official program interrupts a lively conversation. That's a good sign that we're in for a wonderful discussion and event of community and friendship tonight. So good evening, friends, colleagues, parents of students at Upper Canada College, old boys, alumni, and students of Upper Canada College. My name is Brendan Delandria, a graduate of class of 2001. I actually began my time at UCC in this fall, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to tonight's event. I have the honor of serving the college as the Vice Principal of Advancement and as the Executive Director of the UCC Foundation, and I'm so excited for tonight's conversation. On behalf of Upper Canada College, welcome to Weston Hall for what I know will be an insightful and enjoyable conversation about an important, though lesser known topic, and that is the unique and vital role of charitable foundations in Canada. Let me begin by acknowledging where we gathered today. For thousands of years, this has been the traditional land of many people, including the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is home to people of many nations and many First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And I added, for interest on given tonight's topic, an interesting fact from the archives that on the topic of foundations and endowments, and that is that the founding and early operations of Upper Canada College back in 1829 were made possible by the private sale of an endowment of 64,000 acres of land that had been granted to the college out of an endowment of 300,000 acres of land, originally earmarked for what was King's College and what is now the University of Toronto. So follow the logic, land and endowments have been an integral part of the colonial history of our nation and of some of the leading educational institutions in this country today. And it's in the spirit of truth and reconciliation that I take this moment to acknowledge that history and reflect on how that deepens our commitment to using this land for learning, for community, for individual and collective well-being, and for service and community pluralism. So with that, welcome to tonight's Speaking Of series. This series, launched during the dark days of the pandemic, began as a way to keep our community connected when we were all sitting at home in our living rooms. And today we're so thrilled to have a live in-person component to a virtual component with attendees joining us from across Ontario and around the world virtually tonight. Tonight's topic, From Charity to Change, will offer a deep dive into the unique value that charitable foundations bring to the ecosystem of not-for-profits in Canada. The conversation aims to shed light on how Canadian foundations have made a difference in our rapidly evolving society and offer some insights for future directions of foundations. On that note, we're thrilled to welcome our special guests and Ms. Hilary Pearson, who will share the stories of transformational change from her latest book, From Charity to Change, Inside the World of Canadian Foundations, which I see many of you have copies of, published in November 22 by McGill Queen's University Press. So just a quick few notes on format and flow before we introduce our guests to get started. We do have individuals joining us remotely via Zoom. Welcome. You're invited to submit your questions via the chat function throughout tonight's discussion. We'll be writing them on cue cards and handing them to our moderator to ensure that your questions are answered, as well as those that we may hear from the floor, and we invite everyone to ask questions during the period. So without further ado, allow me to make some introductions. Valerie Pringle joins us as today's moderator. Valerie is a longtime friend of the college, and together with her husband, Andy Pringle, class of 1969, a parent of two old boys, Jeffrey 2004 and Anthony 2002, and is now a grandparent to a very promising and spirited young man, currently enrolled in the college in the class of 2035. And as we discussed tonight, Valerie is the daughter of old boy J.A. Whittingham, class of 1939. So quick math, over a century of connection to the college. But that's not all. In addition to a long connection, Valerie has enjoyed a distinguished career in broadcasting and journalism for 50 years. She was a well-known anchor of two national news programs, Midday on CBC and Canada AM on CTV, and is currently host and producer of Canada Files on PBS. Her influence as a journalist was acknowledged by her induction into the Board of Canada as a member in 2006. In her spare time, Valerie has also been a tireless advocate for the treatment of mental illness, currently serving as the chair of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health Foundation. Valerie is also on the board of the Canadian Broadcast Heritage Museum, Belmont House, and the Toronto International Festival of Authors. She's a mentor for the Hilary Pearson Foundation and spent 20 years as a volunteer working to build Trans Canada Trail. Welcome back to the call tonight, Valerie. Our visiting expert speaker on the topic of the evening, Ms. Hilary Pearson. A leading thinker and expert on foundations, Hilary Pearson has had a 20-plus-year career in the field of philanthropy. As the founding president of Philanthropy Foundations Canada, for 18 years, from 2001 to 2019, she worked with many of the largest private charitable foundations in the country. Hilary is the author of numerous articles, book reviews, conferences, publications, poems, and speaks frequently on Canadian philanthropy at conferences and workshops in Canada and around the world. In 2019, Hilary was appointed co-chair of the advisory committee on the charitable sector, advising the federal minister of revenue on policy and regulatory issues. And in July 2018, Ms. Pearson was appointed as a member of the Board of Canada for her contributions to philanthropy in Canada. No stranger as well to the transformative power of education in preparing future leaders and creators. Ms. Pearson currently serves as Chancellor of Brock University, a role which she has held since 2020. And this event, in case you didn't notice, was inspired by this incredible new book that was just published and about which we'll be hearing some insights tonight. So without any further ado, Valerie, thank you.
Well, thank you for coming tonight. Hi to everyone on Zoom. Now, Hilary, obviously, you've been involved with foundations for a very long time, but sorry, is that me? I broke it. Check. That is included. You felt that a book was of value and necessary. Why?
Because I wanted to explain why foundations matter. There's been a lot of change in the philanthropy world, actually, in the last 20 years. I mean, there's an interesting story to tell just about what has been going on in philanthropy. And when I say philanthropy, I should say right away that I'm talking about grant-making, grant-giving foundations. And the word foundation itself, there's no trademark on that word, so lots of organizations use the word foundation in their name. But the world that I'm talking about is the world of grant-giving foundations, mostly private foundations, not all family, but mostly family foundations. And it's an unknown world in Canada. It's just not something that people know very much about. And it's not that there is a complete void. There are a lot of stories out there about foundations, particularly private foundations. And unfortunately, a lot of those stories are negative ones. You know, they are along the lines of, you know, private foundations are secretive, they're opaque, they're elite, they're anti-democratic. You know, you don't know very much about them. You know, it's where, and I certainly heard this, unfortunately, rather a lot when I used to go to Ottawa on behalf of foundations. You know, the view is these are places where wealthy people hide their money from the tax man, which my rejoinder was always, well, that'll be the last thing I would do if I actually wanted to hide my money from the tax man. But they are generally unknown. And the contribution that foundations make to our society and our economy is extraordinary. And it's something to talk about. You know, there are things that have happened in this country which have been seeded by, funded by, catalyzed by private foundations, and we don't know that story.
Okay, so
That's what I want to tell.
let's start. You know, I'm sure this is a pretty literate crowd and they're here because they're interested in this. So they probably know a lot of this stuff. But if people did say, how can you start a foundation? How much money do you need? Why would you start a foundation? You know, what's the difference between public and private foundations? So ABCs.
Okay, so very quick, because I think this is a knowledgeable audience. Private foundation, actually the nomenclature public-private is something the government imposes. So the government decides whether you are a public foundation or a private foundation, and essentially turns on the question of control. Now, who is in control? Is it a group of related individuals, or are they at arm's length? So a public foundation is something like hospital foundation.
Center for Addiction and Mental Health.
Right, exactly. Or a community foundation, typically a board of people who are not related to each other. A private foundation, family foundation, which is governed by a family, clearly those people are related to each other, and actually corporate foundations. So the RBC Foundation is a private foundation because the money, the capital has come from a single source. And the reason why there is this categorization by the government is because they have special rules for private foundations. They want to make sure that private foundations are not self-dealing, that people are not taking advantage of having a foundation to loan money back to themselves at no interest, or to do something that does seem to be scamming the system, essentially. That is the main difference.
So the point of having a foundation is to have your money separate and hived off,
Right.
so that you can donate it.
Right, and that is one of the things, that's right. I mean, one of the things that people don't quite appreciate is that when you give the money to a foundation, it is given away. It's not your money anymore, it's the foundation's. And it is governed by certain rules. You can't take it back. Certainly, you can't get a tax benefit or a gift that you've made and then you take it back again. So once you've done that, and I think that inspires a lot of people to create foundations, this idea that you can set aside an endowment and that you will be making grants or gifts to charities on a regular basis for years. And for a lot of families, the attraction is the generational issue. It's how to bring the family together around the table, first generation, second generation, even third generation. And there's been enough private foundations in Canada that we're now, after about 80 years, we're now getting fifth and sixth generation of families that are engaged in philanthropy. That's a big attraction, I think, for a lot of families and donors who think, we want to perpetuate, we want to give back to our community, and we want to do it with our family.
So is that the motivation you found for most families of why they create a foundation?
There are different motivations, really, and that is one of the things that's changing. Our foundation's set up forever. Perpetuity itself, I don't think is applicable. Who knows what's going to happen 100 years from now? But the idea of long life, I prefer to use the idea of long life. A foundation is set up for some period that's going to extend beyond your next year. And as a donor, frankly, if you're thinking year to year and you're giving on an annual basis, I don't think about setting up a foundation. But if you want to do something that ensures a sustained commitment and you want to do it over a number of years, foundation is pretty attractive because the money is then set aside. You can give the return on the invested endowment, and you can continue to support organizations, causes. You can make something happen over a period of years. The long life, I think, is the important idea there in a foundation.
How many foundations are there now?
There are about, and I say about, where the information comes from the Canada Revenue Agency, and it's always a bit lagging, but there are about 11,000 foundations. The latest figures, which are not this year's figures, are about a year and a half old. I think it's about 6,500 private foundations, and the rest are public foundations. So you have more private foundations than public, and that the rate of increase of private foundations is pretty steep, actually. What we've seen over the last, I would say, decade is a real interest in creating private foundations, and many more private foundations being created in public. Public foundations have leveled off in terms of how many there are.
Why do you do that?
Because there's more wealth in the country, more people making money, more people thinking about philanthropy, more people thinking about the advantages of having a foundation. Again, for this purpose of a sustained commitment over time to making change. The reason why I call the book actually From Charity to Change is because I wanted to document, I wanted to tell the story of how people are thinking now about their foundations. And it's not simply because they want to be charitable. They want to make change. They want to make something happen. They want to be players in our ecosystem of philanthropy. And there are more and more foundations that I think are doing that.
Is it up to the foundation to sort of create social change? I mean, that is a question for the Canadians too, more than Americans. And you, because you look at the system in the UK, the US, you know, many different cultures, but in Canada, we always look to the government to do things.
Right. Yeah, and the government, of course, has been in Canada has been fundamentally important to ensuring that there is a floor for most Canadians when it comes to health or education, public education, certainly at the primary and secondary level. And those are huge advantages for Canadians. And I think most Canadians would want that. What you see in the United States is, yes, a lot of American foundations intervening in primary education and providing basic health support because Americans don't have it. So in Canada, yes, you're right, we do have a different relationship, but I think that puts the onus on foundations to take risk. Because I think this is one of the great advantages of a private foundation, that you can take risk in a way that an individual donor might not consider, a government certainly doesn't want to do, and a corporation typically will not do either. It is unique. You're not answerable to shareholders or to voters. You know, you can do something and then have it fail. And it doesn't really matter, you can carry on. Not because you're seeking failure, but you can learn from failure. And then you can do something to improve.
Like a venture capitalist.
Yeah. But you can also, I think, as a private foundation, and to take your venture capitalist idea too, I think you can seed ideas, you can fund pilot projects, you can be a change maker by supporting things that have no proof of concept, that don't have evidence to support them yet, but that need to be tried so that you know that it can actually succeed. And I give a lot of examples.
Yeah, so I was just going to say,
right.
Gibbs on that. There are some great stories and focused on different elements and aspects of things that need work.
Well, I mean, to take an area that you're interested in, Valerie, mental health, the Beck Foundation in Montreal. The Beck Foundation was set up by Tony Beck, some of you might know Tony. His son, Brian Beck, had schizophrenia, died in his 20s, as unfortunately many young schizophrenic patients do. And he set up a foundation named after his son, initially to support research into schizophrenia, which he felt was lacking and which still needs a lot of support. But over time, the family that was all involved in the foundation, they decided that what they really wanted to do was to create more access for young people to diagnosis and treatment, quicker access, because this was a gap. 19 to 25-year-olds, schizophrenia often develops in that time of your life. Families, when you become an adult patient at the age of 19, families are not able to participate in your treatment if you don't want them to be involved. And a lot of young people don't want their families to engage around that, but they're lost. They're young people. They don't know how to get access to treatment. And I think while Brian Beck, did have support his family, and a lot of young people don't, the Beck family thought that was what they could do, that there was a unique opportunity there. But they were very creative about what they did. First of all, and by the way, this is not a big foundation in terms of assets. That's an important thing to say, that you don't need to have a lot of money to make a huge difference. So Beck, in the last 15 years, has done some remarkable things. They have now, through committed, sustained focus and funding, they've created a network of what they call integrated youth services for young people with mental illness or with incipient mental illness across Canada. They've enlisted governments, so provincial governments. They've been very focused on trying to get policymakers in the mental health area together with each other. They've done a lot of convening. They've done a lot of supportive research, but also the dissemination of knowledge from that research, mobilized knowledge, so that it's been quite an activist role that they've played. But they have done something arguably a government, a company, an individual donor would not have been able to do. And that's one of the stories that I tell.
And just in that mental health piece, you also mentioned in the book, Daymark, the
Yes.
Michael McCain's Families Foundation.
Right.
Newer, the next generation coming along.
Absolutely. No, I want to write, I already have a second edition, you know, that I'm thinking about, because there's so many interesting things that are happening. Younger people, young family members who are, as the McCain example, I actually spent a bit of time with the younger McCains as they were thinking about what they wanted to do. They were all committed to mental health, but they've chosen this area, perinatal mental health, which is an underfunded, under-researched area. And they've hired someone right away. This is another, I think, success factor, that you commit to not only an institutional framework for your philanthropy, but to build the capacity for that institutional framework. You hire staff, and you do what is necessary to have the kind of impact you need to have. Again, the Beck Foundation, it's not big staff, but you know, 2 or 3 very committed people, properly supported, we do an amazing number of things. So yeah, Daymark is just starting. They hired someone right away. They have a very clearly articulated theory of change. They said, why do we want to do this? How are we going to do it? How are we going to measure ourselves? And we're going to talk to you, being anybody who wants to understand what they're doing. We're going to talk to you along the way. That's another thing actually that I'm hoping more private foundations will do. They need to tell their story. They need to be more open about what they're doing, what they're trying, why they're doing it. You don't have to go into chapter and verse on, you know, how you've made decisions and why you've chosen charity A over charity B or partner A over partner B. But I think you do have a certain accountability, public accountability, and telling the story helps others understand what you're trying to do, and might also motivate other people to work with you and collaborate with you.
It's, you know, as you said, when you started to look into this, there were a lot of critics, and when you were representing foundations, certainly not like using the word with this journalistic, opaque, you know, you say very few have websites, sort of almost secretive. And the only people who know about foundations, much of the people who are looking for money. And a lot of them spend a huge amount of time writing proposals. It's almost a full-time job approaching foundations and figuring out foundations.
Right. Yeah, and I think unfortunately, you know, this kind of cold calling approach, you know, sending in a grant proposal to a foundation that you don't have a relationship with and don't really understand because they're not telling you anything about who they are. It's a terrible waste of time. It's a waste of time for you, the charity. It's a waste of time for the foundation that's trying to deal with these unsolicited requests. So a website of a page, you know, these days, it's sort of almost a no-brainer, you know, set up a website, just say to people, this is how you want to be approached. If you don't want to be approached, say that, you know, just tell people what it is that you're about. And you don't have to have, and I should say this, it's important. It's not that you actually have to have a specific mission. You know, the idea that you could support a lot of different charities, it's totally fine. I mean, I think one of the great things about philanthropy is that it's an independent thing. You know, the government's not telling you who to give the money to. You have a choice. And I think that's what attracts people to philanthropy. I would not want to take that away from them. But I also think that it is important to be a little more open about, especially if you set up a foundation, it's important to be a little more open about what you're doing, how you want to be approached, who you are, etc. A lot of that information is public anyway, because you have to report to the Canada Revenue Agency every year. As soon as you set up a charity. One of the things they used to say to people all the time was, you know, a private foundation is not private. If you want to stay private as a donor, don't set up a foundation, because you do have to make this report to the CRA, and the CRA puts it all out there. Anybody can find this information. They can find out who's on your board. They can find out, you know, what grants you've made, how much, to who. They'll know, because the CRA won't ask, what is it you're trying to accomplish? What's the outcome you're looking for? What's the role you're trying to play? And so that's up to you as a foundation. You know, if you want to tell people about that, I think you should.
Did you find, or did you find that foundations, private foundations are more successful if they have an independent management structure, executive director, etc. And if it helps the family, or the family just keeps control.
I think it can go either way. I think there are foundations, the McConnell Foundation, which is one of the oldest foundations in the country and one of the largest by assets. So it's now, I never have the latest figures, but I think it's up around 700 million in assets. That makes it one of the bigger ones. We are not, by the way, the United States, so we don't have China. No, I mean, we do have the MasterCard Foundation, which I want to say here is it causes all kinds of difficulties in terms of accurate reporting on really what the size of our foundation sector is in Canada. MasterCard it's now, I think, around 40 billion in assets. It's one of the largest private foundations in the world. Does most of its work outside of Canada. They're very generous with Indigenous programming and Indigenous communities, but aside from that, they don't really play in the Canadian philanthropic landscape. But they distort the numbers because they're so big. So the rest of private foundations all added up. I think the 2021 numbers is something like $48 billion in assets. That's a lot of money. That is a lot of money. And I think there are some multi-billion-dollar foundations like the Chagnon Foundation, the Azrieli Foundation, a number of others that are starting to appear. We may be getting into sort of some of the mega foundations that the United States has. But all that said, most foundations in Canada are pretty small. And, most foundations are not, they don't have a lot of stuff. But it depends very much on what you're trying to accomplish and how you want to do it. So you're going to have more staff if you are running more programs. And there's nothing to stop a private foundation from effectively working like an operating charity. You don't have to give money. There's no imposition, the government's not saying to you, you must give grants. As long as you have programming on which you spend money every year. It's not that you can spend no money, but if you have your own operations as a private foundation, that's fine. You can spend 100% of your income on your own operations. A public foundation, by contrast, does have to give grants out. So more than 50% of its income has to be given in the form of grants. So there is a distinction there between public and private. That said, private foundations typically are grant givers. They don't tend to run their own operations. And they're governed, some of them mostly by family, others completely independently. So an example that I write about for the book is the Laidlaw Foundation. Laidlaw was started by a single donor. In fact, most of the foundations I write about in the book are over 20 years old. And that was one of my criteria for choosing the foundations I did write about. I wanted a track record. I wanted to be able to see a history, an evolution that I could write about. So most of these foundations are more than 20 years old. Laidlaw started, as most of them did, single donor who had a passion, or two or three, gave to the ballet, gave to environmental issues, gave to hospitals and to health causes. And that's how many foundations do get started. That's how many donors do operate initially. But over time, the Laidlaw Foundation has become very focused. So now they are funding youth in Ontario, and it's youth who need support, youth in care, youth coming out of the foster care system, youth who are in the criminal justice system, kids who need support. And the board of the Laidlaw Foundation is now made up almost entirely of young people, unrelated people. There are a couple of Laidlaws still, I think, on the board, but basically it's operating like a public foundation in that way. And there's no reason why that couldn't happen either. It just depends on the evolution and the decisions that are made, as the foundation grows and changes.
In one line in the book, you talked about a shift in power happening from grantors, benevolence, to grantees, right? Sort of trying to, I guess, help initiate and direct where the programs are and where the need is.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the pandemic and what happened in 2020 and after, but not just the pandemic, but as we all recall, some of the turbulence of the summer of 2020, the calls for social justice and equity, which the pandemic also, I think, highlighted. That has really made a difference to at least the public discussion around the behavior of philanthropy, the role of it's particularly true in the United States, but it has spilled over in Canada as well. And there is a lot more talk now about participatory grant making and what they call trust-based philanthropy. And the idea of that is trust-based philanthropy is the idea that you, as a funder, that you will trust your partner and that you will give unconditionally to the partner. So if you are giving to a charity, you're not imposing conditions on that charity. You're not even asking potentially for a report from that charity. You have exercised due diligence. I think that's important to say. As a funder, you do have to understand who you're working with. And ideally, actually, in trust-based philanthropy, you've built a relationship of trust between you as a funder and the charity as a recipient. But once you've built that relationship, the money is handed over for the charity to do what they need to do. And you're not going to impose conditions on that. That would be the basic idea. How many foundations are actually doing that in Canada?
I was on the board of Stephen Lewis Foundation, and it's very much
That
they know what they're doing, they know what they need. The grandmothers, the women in Africa, we're not going to try and measure and fit into some chart that we're told, is saying how good they are or how well they're doing. Right. We think that's worship, so we're just going to give them.
Well, and social change is hard to measure. You can't say, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, that there is a hard, measurable difference that you as a foundation can attribute to the funding that you have given. I mean, this whole question of attribution, I think as a foundation, I wouldn't be thinking about that. You can't claim that you are fully responsible for a change that has happened or is about to happen. And with social change as well, the outcomes that can take years to be seen. I think it's futile to chase after annual measures or to try and get into sort of hard and fast metrics of impact. There has been talk about that. And in the book, I talk about different ways in which philanthropy since the beginning of the century, has evolved from the idea of being an investor, an angel investor potentially, with the sort of metrics of an angel investor and an exit strategy, which often doesn't materialize, to the idea of strategic philanthropy. Again, setting targets, setting goals, being very rigorous and disciplined about what you're going to do, and how you're going to do it, how you're going to measure it, which I think in practice has also proven to be very difficult to carry out. And now we're talking much more about this sort of idea of partnership and collaboration, which has its own challenges. A lot of foundations are not really set up to collaborate and not set up as partners. The sort of structure of a foundation, there aren't incentives for foundations to collaborate or to behave as partners.
Well, again, are there examples of some that have worked or not in that regard?
More so now, yes. Yeah, we're definitely getting any. I talk about this in the book. I think some of the newer foundations are thinking about collaboration right from the start. The Beck Foundation actually is another good example. I'll go back to them. They initially, when they were starting to do this work in youth mental health, they initiated a collaboration with the government, with the CIHR, actually, which had never been done before. And a private foundation collaborating with the government funder is unusual. But the idea there was that by combining their forces, they could also foster more collaboration within the system that they were working in. So they actually set up a sort of challenge grant where this was the beginning of this thinking through this idea of integrated youth services, creating essentially storefront centers that youth could come into, where they could get different sorts of services, you know, either treatment or diagnosis or simply information. But what Beth was asking and the CIHR were asking grantees to do, potential grantees, they had a competition essentially, and they said, we want groups of people to come together. So they had to be people from the community, people who were researchers, people who were clinicians, people who were treatment providers. They had to create teams. So already, you know, a kind of intersectional sort of group of people who were collaborating. And those teams were brought together by the foundation and the CIHR to talk to each other about their proposals. Like, how are you going to do this? How are you going to do this? And what can I learn from what you're doing? And while one team did end up getting the full grant from CIHR and Beck, all the others benefited because they participated in this kind of collaborative approach to the thinking that they were doing on integrated youth services. And that just sort of turbocharged the whole system, you know, made it develop a lot faster.
So, and where did that come from? Was that leadership, an example of great leadership?
Yeah.
Was that innovation?
That, yes, I mean, I think if I had to say that I had learned one thing about these very different 20 or so foundations that I've been about, leadership, consistent leadership is really the key. And the leadership can come from the board, it can come from the donor, it can come from the staff leader. Typically, it's a combination, but it has to be leadership that is kind of a combination of risk-taking, but also willing to learn. So humble leadership in that sense, you know, it's not, I figure all this out, I know what I'm going to do, and I'm going to tell everybody else what to do. It's, we think we have an idea, we think we can make something happen. Let's see what we can do. And if we learn from that, then we'll make it even better. But we're going to do it over time. We're going to do it for as long as it takes. And so that idea, long life, again, we come back to this notion that, you know, the great value of foundations in our system is that they can do that, they can take that long life approach, they can stick with something, they can see it happening over time, and they can adjust, they can sort of change the strategy if they need to, because they're learning from things as they go along. So that combination of the curiosity, the ability to take a risk, commitment, and that humility, you know, to change when you have to change.
Well, we gave a major case to government, and as you make your case in the book, how do you compel people to see how much foundations have mattered to Canadians and to our society?
Yeah. I think you have to tell stories. You have to tell a lot of stories. You know, one of the things I learned, and I talk at the beginning of the book about my interview, my job interview for Philanthropic Foundations Canada. So I'll say right away that I didn't know anything about philanthropy before I was interviewed for the job. I was working as a consultant in the nonprofit sector. So I worked with a lot of nonprofits, and I had some foundations back in 2001, but I couldn't say that I was an expert anyway. And this group of foundation leaders were sitting there looking at me and saying, we need someone to tell our story, to government, because in the absence of us telling our story, what government thinks is that we are soaking up public money, essentially. That, you know, any donor who gets a tax benefit from making a donation to a private foundation is otherwise taking public money that could be spent democratically and accountably by government on things that matter to the Canadian people. So why would a government support private philanthropy? Please help us tell that story. And I realized that, you know, not only was I going to have to work pretty hard to figure out what that story was, but I was working into a counter story. It wasn't a void, you know, the counter story was anti-democratic, opaque, rich people.
In Jamaica saying they're having a foundation meeting.
And taking the corporate plane to the meeting. Yeah, exactly. And there have been stories like that, not so much in Canada, but in the United States, there have been those stories. It was those kinds of stories that actually led to this huge reform of the tax system in the United States in 1969, which brought in a lot of the self-dealing rules that we now also have in Canada. And the specific thing I was being asked to do actually by these foundation leaders was to convince the federal government that the capital gains tax treatment of donations of securities, shares, publicly traded shares, right, to private foundations.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
We all have to say that.
No, I agree. But let me say, Don Johnson got that going. But the government had decided that they were going to skew the donation towards public foundations and charities, not to private foundations. So the government was actually intervening in a donor choice. The government was saying these charities better than this charity. And what my board was saying to me was make the playing field a level playing field. Incentivize philanthropy, but don't make a decision for us about which kind of philanthropy is better. So I had to prove that private philanthropy had value, that it was important for us to have private foundations, that they did something that public foundations and public charities didn't do, and that it was worthwhile for the government to provide that tax incentive equally to all charities, including private foundations. So that brings you back to, all right, how do we show them that, you know, the risk-taking, that innovation, that experimentation is what private foundations can contribute to the system? We have to tell that story. And it took a while, you know, back in 2001, most private foundations I was talking to said, oh, no, don't tell the story about me. It's not about me. It's about, if anybody, it's about the grantee. And please tell the story of the grantee. And I would say, yeah, the grantee can tell the story of the grantee. But we need to tell your story too, because if we don't talk about what foundations have done, nobody's going to know.
Awkwardness. Rich people feeling awkward.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a bit of a Canadian, you know, like a bunch of ourselves. You know, it's not about
One dozen.
one doesn't exactly. You know, things have changed. I mean, remember in 2001, you know, virtually no social media. You know, very little, as you said earlier, Valerie, you know, most foundations did not have websites. It was like, what? Why would anybody have a website? So things have really changed, you know, significantly in the 20 years. And I think foundations are, as a sector, are probably feeling the pressure of accountability, of needing to be accountable, because all of us are feeling that pressure. You know, different parts of society are feeling that pressure, be more open, to be transparent. There's that expectation. And it's even more so when it's connected to very wealthy people and what they do. So again, 2020 and forward, you know, we have seen a lot of calls for people to be more open, to be for institutions that are run by wealthy people to be accountable and to be transparent. Yeah, and that goes to the power shifting issue, you know, and that's still a very, again, the foundation model doesn't really lend itself easily to an idea that you would shift power. I mean, this is about me as a donor. It's about my stuff. This is about even my asset. I get to make these decisions. Yeah, well, the world is changing. So, you know, we need to think about that.
Let me just say that, you know, we can, happy to take questions. And if you've got, Jill might have some from the Zoom people or the chat perhaps, so we can get those in a sec. But yes, no, please weigh in.
Thank you. That's so insightful. What I wanted to ask was, you talk about significant change in the last 20 years. And one of the significant changes that I've observed, having been on the fundraising side in some wonderful organizations, is that government grants have significantly declined on a sliding scale. Yeah. So if an organization or charity used to make 60% of their budget being funded by the government, that's now maybe 20%. And so I would ask you this: do you think there is a tipping point of pressure on private philanthropy to make up for that gap? And if so, I mean, what is the solution? Because there's only 11,000 foundations, and each one has their own specific mandate. And once you uncover what that mandate is. I mean, a cultural icon like the Toronto Symphony Orchestra now depends mostly on foundations and private philanthropic dollars to survive. So should that not be a government for cultural icon of that significance? I just think we're in a kind of a process right now. And I feel like for private philanthropists, there's enormous pressure and donors to take on that.
Well, I agree. I think there is a lot of pressure and there is.
And donor fatigue.
And donor fatigue, for sure, for sure. We've all been involved, I think, in fundraising as well as giving. And yeah, it is difficult. Remember though, that 48 billion seems like a lot, but it's not. And, you know, in terms of grants, if you look at the fundamental model of a foundation, the endowment, which you're trying to preserve in terms of value over time. So you're giving, you know, disbursement quota was 3.5%, now it's 5%. But if you are giving as a funder 5% per year, I mean, there are a lot of people here who are much more expert than I am in financial markets. You know, it's pretty tough right now, giving 5% and trying to maintain value over time of your endowment is going to be a challenge. But, you know, the model of the foundation does not suggest that that the foundation is going to be giving a lot more. And even though we have more foundations and there is more wealth in the country, and therefore there are more philanthropic dollars being spent, they'll never be equal to anywhere close to what governments fund in Canada. So it's 3.5 billion is about the amount that private foundations have given in a year. And 2021, I think that was the, you know, 3.5 billion doesn't go very far, really. Individual donors are getting more multi-million-dollar gifts. So we're all reading about that. You know, hospitals in particular seem to be doing very well. You know, congratulations. You know,
Some gifts were very happy.
universities.
We're happy about them all.
No, but universities and hospitals are.
Yeah, you're saying 100, 200 million dollars.
Yeah, no, there's the new wealth in our country is showing up in the form of those kinds of gifts. And I think that's great. You know, what foundations do is not the same though. You know, yes, of course, foundations will give universities and hospitals, but I think the best use of a foundation is not to supplement or to replace government funding, or even to do the same thing as a private donor's annual or major commitment to that kind of institution. I mean, it goes back to this question of risk-taking, innovation, experimentation, trying to find those gaps, trying to be a catalyst for change that it may take years to see. You know, and the Beck Foundation, again, is that example. They don't have a lot of money, but they used it really carefully and really well. And they created change that would not have happened if they had not done what they've done. So that's the best use of foundation money. I'm not trying to replace fill the gap. The gap will not be filled that way. And maybe one more thing that I can say. There is a lot of pressure on endowments now of all kinds to consider social investment, impact investment, you know, use your money for mission, do more investing that is going to create some kind of social return, as well as hopefully a financial return. And I think that's legitimate. I think that's interesting. There certainly has been a huge development in that market, and we're all hearing about that kind of investing. But again, we know foundations don't have that much money. Frankly, a pension fund committed to, you know, social investing, you see a much bigger impact in Canada than if more foundations did it. That said, I do actually think that foundation boards and staff should be thinking about that and should be thinking about their capital and how they deploy it, whether it's through granting, through operations, through staff, through capacity building of their own, through investing. You know, there are different ways in which you can deploy capital for mission. And I think boards could be a little more creative about how they think about their capital instead of hiving off investments and grants in two different places.
All right, we got 3 good questions here.
Okay.
Federal government has made change to the disbursement quota, raising the minimum annual disbursement from 3.5% to 5%. Where do you see this going and how should foundations be thinking about future regulatory change?
I don't think the government's going to increase the quota again. That said, God knows, but I don't think that is going to happen again. They have committed, the government did say that they would review this. They didn't commit themselves to a period, but I'm guessing they're not going to review it for another 3 to 4 to maybe 5 years. And I think they have to collect more data. One of the things you mentioned, Valerie Pringle, I guess mentioned earlier that I'm on the advisory committee on the charitable sector, which advises the Minister of Revenue and the Minister of Finance. And we made an argument when this whole debate was happening that if you want to do evidence-based policymaking, you need more evidence. And the evidence we have on whether foundations are meeting the disbursement quota, how much each foundation is actually spending, it's pretty limited. The CRA is not collecting that kind of data on a timely basis, and they're not making it available. So in fact, the Department of Finance didn't really know, to be honest, what was really happening in the disbursement area. They guessed that more disbursements that foundations could manage 5%. Of course, that was a year ago now, and markets have definitely not supported that, right? So, over the next 3 or 4 years, we may get the evidence that foundations are having trouble meeting that quota, and
it might go back.
And it might. I'm not sure that governments, the public, I don't think would tolerate a return to 3.5, because right now there's still this story about piles of money that wealthy people are sitting on. That story keeps coming back, and it has to be countered. Which is again why foundations need to tell their story.
Okay, are existing tax benefits adequate? If not, how would they be enhanced to incentivize the creation of more foundations that can have greater impact on social change?
Did Donald Johnson ask that question?
Yes, he must be on the Zoom call.
I don't think we need more tax incentives. I actually don't. And for 2 reasons. One, I think we have pretty generous tax incentives right now. So I'm not really lined up with Donald Johnson on this one right now. And I'm not sure that it's tax incentives that drive behavior. It's nice to have. I wouldn't like to see a situation where we have no tax incentives. I'm not arguing with that. But I don't know that adding on more tax incentives is going to change philanthropic behavior.
Or inspire people to do.
And we already have quite a steady rate of increase of private foundations. So I don't know that we need more.
All right. What advice do you have for organizations seeking the trust-based philanthropy of foundation? Speaking to the not-for-profit leader. Trust me. Just hand over your money and trust me. And I'm being this.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to the question of how do these marriages, these relationships get made? How can a charity figure out which foundation might support what they're trying to do? And it's still very tough. There are directories out there. You can look back and look at the track record of a foundation because the CRA will tell you that you have to do your own research on that. There are Grant Connect and other directories that are out there will tell you some of that. But it's still a guess. If the foundation is not, telling you through a website or through some other form of communication, annual reports, the publications that they're willing to make, information about what you're doing, as a charity is very important. More foundations, I think, are feeling the pressure to figure out who to work with. So I think there's certainly an incentive from the philanthropy side around finding partners who you can work with. So Mackenzie Scott, the United States, everyone is hearing about. Mackenzie Scott is handing out huge amounts of money with apparently not much research. She's calling people up and saying, and they had never applied to her. They had not, the charities that she's giving money to, in most cases, have not said to Mackenzie Scott, look what we're doing over here. Would you like to support it? They're getting the phone call and they're just amazed. What she is doing though, is she's using intermediaries. And I would love to see more intermediaries in Canada, more organizations, and there are some that are starting to do this work, helping to frame the landscape, research the landscape for funders and for donors. So if you are interested in youth mental health, here's who's doing what in this area. Here's what is interesting. Here's where a gap is. So, you know, Terry Smith is in the group, yeah, exactly. You can hire someone who's, you know, really smart and knows the landscape and can give you advice as a donor. You know, here are some really interesting organizations that are doing important work in this area. You want to fund them. And then they get a phone call. And, you know, they never even made the proposal. You have found them. If we had more intermediaries, I think we would all be better off. The Canadian philanthropy landscape is still underserved in that respect. You know, we still have a thin infrastructure, and that's frustrating. I think we need to mature as a sector, you know, and maybe with more money coming into the sector, we will start to see more of that happening.
And maybe, you know, as Alison mentioned, if the government stuff is going down, that it will be more necessary, and therefore, you know, the need will drive that.
We're seeing it in the banks, the financial institutions who are setting up donor advised funds. We haven't talked about donor advised funds. That's an alternative. Yeah, I know. Yeah, we got to link that here. But there is, I think, some good philanthropic advising happening in those foundations that are running donor advised funds. So, and I think the whole sort of philanthropy advising industry is starting to really build. So we may see a lot of change by this, which is good.
Well, that's what you are all about, charity change.
Absolutely. Keep charity change. Yeah.
And
Thank you all for buying my book and for being here. I really appreciate it.
Hilary, that was really enlightening and inspiring, given us a lot to think about, and told a story that just like to thank you very much for your insight, for sharing your expertise. And as a token of thanks, we do have some gifts here. They were custom developed for you by students in the Atkins Family Design Lab. And I'll have an opportunity to just comment. But before I do, huge thanks to our attendees, our participants, our viewers from home. And I'd like to thank a few people in particular for their support of this event. Members of the advancement team, Samantha Kerbel, Farah Gina, Nikki Marston, Alicia Lergy, Anna Henry, Alexander Stepановich, David Shaw, Jim Blakey, all here. And happy to talk to you, by the way, about the impact of our foundation. But also to the amazing students who've been helping us with the technology. Jack Guilfoyle, class of 23, Ray Wu, class of 24, Jefferson Ding, 24, and for our photographer, Edmund Sun, class of 25. Big round of thanks to you all for your support. We invite you to stay, enjoy some drink and some food, continue the conversation amongst yourselves. But again, our heartfelt thanks to both.
Thank you.